I have carried this for 43 years. I want to be plain about that number, because I have had time to think about what 43 years of silence weighs, and I have decided that weight belongs to someone else now. My wife Dottie passed in the spring of 2019, and somewhere in the months after I buried her, I understood that the arrangement we had made without ever quite making it, the arrangement where neither of us spoke of what came back to our porch at dawn on July the 16th, 1981, that arrangement died with her. What I am going to tell you is this. My 6-year-old daughter Maren disappeared from our property outside Terrace, British Columbia, on the evening of July 14th. And 36 hours later, something walked her home. I watched it happen. I am not a person given to imprecision, and I want you to understand that before we go any further, because what I am about to describe does not fit inside the categories that a man like me is supposed to reach for. And I have been very careful over a very long time to make sure I am not wrong about what I saw. To understand why I was standing on that porch in the grey light before sunrise, I need to take you back to what kind of man I was and what kind of country I was standing in. I was 30 years old in the summer of 1981. I had been working as a Crown timber cruiser out of the Skeena District office since 1973, which made it 8 years in the trade at that point. Timber cruising is not a glamorous occupation, and it does not attract romantics. You are paid to walk ground that no one else has walked and to estimate the merchantable volume of standing timber in a given block, and the accuracy of your estimate is the measure of your worth. You carry a Biltmore stick, a clinometer, a hip chain, and enough personal judgment to know when the slope correction is going to matter and when it is not. You learn to read country. You learn what a cut bank tells you about water table depth, what the undergrowth species tells you about the last time a drainage burned, what the sound of a creek at a given elevation tells you about snowpack and seasonal flow. You spend enough years at that work and you develop a particular relationship with wilderness that has nothing mystical about it. It is the relationship of a tradesman to his material. You know it the way a millwright knows a piece of equipment, not by feeling, by hours. By 1981, I had logged somewhere close to 11,000 field hours in the Skeena country, most of it in the Coast Mountains watershed between Terrace and the Nass Valley. I knew that ground. I am telling you all of this because a man who knows country that well is not supposed to see what I saw. And I want you to understand that I know that, and I have known it for 43 years, and it has not changed what I saw. Dottie and I had the property on a side road off the Calum Lake Road, about 14 kilometers from town. We had bought 5 acres with a small house and a good well in 1979, when Maren was 4 years old, and I was still holding on to the idea that a man could live close to the work and keep his family fed in the same place. The house sat in a clearing that had been logged over maybe 15 years before we bought it, and the second growth had come in thick on 3 sides. On the 4th side there was a route road, which is what we called the old skid path, left over from the original logging operation, and that route road ran roughly north for about 400 meters before it hit the wall of standing timber that marked the beginning of unroaded Crown land. It was good country for children in the summer if you were watching them. Maren knew the clearing. She knew the route road to the edge of the trees. She knew the shed and the garden and the boundary of what was hers. We had a blue heeler named Bud, 4 years old that summer, a compact and serious dog who had been working with me long enough to understand that his opinion about the country was worth something. He was not a barker for the sake of barking. When Bud went quiet, it meant something, and when Bud settled, it meant something different. I had learned to pay attention to which one it was. The evening of July 14th was the kind of evening that Skeena country produces in midsummer. Clear, warm, the light staying well past 9 o'clock, and the mosquitoes just starting to lift off the grass at the edge of the trees. I had come back from the field at about 6. Dottie was putting dinner together, and Maren had been playing in the clearing. There was nothing unusual about any of it. Dottie called Maren in at 7:30, and she was not there. She called again. Bud went to the door and stood with his nose at the gap, which was the thing he did when he was checking the weather, not sounding alarmed, just attending. I walked the clearing and the route road to the Treeline. I called her name. The light was still good enough to see the mud at the edge of the route road, and there were her tracks, small and barefooted, going north toward the timber. I want to try to describe what that felt like. A man who reads ground for a living, looking at a child's tracks going toward unroaded timber at dusk. But I do not have the words for it that are appropriate to this register, so I will tell you instead what I did. I went north. I followed her tracks for about 80 meters before they became uncertain in the grass and gravel at the edge of the standing timber. And then I was calling into the trees in the last of the light and not getting an answer. And Dottie was at the road with a flashlight, and by 9 o'clock I had been into the first 500 meters of that drainage twice without finding her. We called the RCMP detachment in Terrace at 9:15. The volunteer search and rescue coordinator for Skeena District was a man named Les Arcand, and he had a crew on our property by 11 that night. Les was a solid man. He did not waste words and he did not waste your time. He had his crew organized in sectors within 40 minutes of arrival, and they worked through the night with the equipment they had, which in 1981 meant flashlights, a few handheld radios, and the collective knowledge of men who had walked that country most of their lives. By dawn on July 15th, they had not found her. Les sat with me at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with a topographic map of the drainage spread between us and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and he showed me the sectors they had covered and the sectors they had not. He was not without hope. A 6-year-old child in summer conditions, warm night, no rain, close to rain. Those were not the worst circumstances. They went back in at 7. Dottie did not sleep. I watched her stand at the window for most of that first day, facing the route road, and I understood without her saying anything that she was not going to accept a conclusion she had not seen with her own eyes. That was Dottie. She was a woman who had grown up in the Bulkley Valley, who had seen enough of what the country could do and what it could give back, and she had a stubbornness in her about outcomes that I had, over 11 years of marriage, learned was not obstinacy. It was a kind of accuracy. She did not accept things that were not settled. She would not settle this. The SAR crew worked through the day of July 15th and into the late afternoon, logging 22 hours of ground search before weather moved in from the coast. By early evening on the 15th, there was rain and a ceiling low enough to make the helicopter option, which they had been trying to arrange, effectively unavailable. Les came to the house again at 9 that evening. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table, and he said the words that I had known since mid-afternoon were coming. He said the district was standing the crew down for the night due to conditions, and that if morning brought no improvement in the ceiling, they would have to reassess the operational picture. He was as gentle about it as a man of his character could be. He had logged 31 hours against my daughter. He had nothing left to offer the weather. Dottie was standing in the doorway to the kitchen when Les said that. She did not say anything. She went to the window and stood there, and I watched Les not look at her because there was nothing to say to a woman standing at a window in the rain, waiting for her child. I sat up that night. Bud sat with me on the floor beside the wood stove, his head on my boot, and I listened to the rain on the metal roof. I tried to make the mathematics of it work. A 6-year-old child in the Skeena timber, 36 hours and counting, rain coming in. I tried to make rational accounting cover the space where Maren was, and rational accounting could not get there. And at some point, after 2 in the morning, I stopped trying. The rain thinned before 4, and by 4:30 the sky over the timber was lightening at its eastern edge. I was on the porch when that happened. Bud had come outside with me, and he was standing at the edge of the porch boards facing north, toward the root road and the tree line, and his body was entirely still in a way that was not the stillness of sleep or the stillness of cold. It was the stillness of a dog that is receiving information and processing it. His tail was down, and his ears were up, and his hackles, and I want to be specific here because I know the difference. His hackles were flat, not raised. Whatever was coming down the root road toward us in the grey pre-dawn light, Bud had already decided it was not a threat. I stood up from the porch step and I looked north, and I saw Maren first. She was at the far end of the root road, at the distance where in ordinary daylight you can make out a person's gait, but not their expression. She was walking. She was walking steadily and straight, not the walk of a child who is lost and stumbling, but the walk of a child who knows where she is going and is going there, deliberately. She was barefoot. She had been barefoot when she left the previous evening, and she was barefoot now, and she was walking on a root road that had spent the night in rain, and she was walking the way a child walks when someone is walking with her. There was something behind her. I want to be careful here because I have had 43 years to think about how to say this, and I'm still not satisfied that any version of it is adequate. At the edge of the root road, where the standing timber meets the cleared ground, there was a shape in the grey light that did not resolve into any category I had prepared for myself. It was large. Larger than a man by a margin I cannot express without sounding as though I am performing, so I will use the one number I am certain of. When it stood at the tree line, the crown of its head was roughly level with the lowest branches of the second-growth cottonwood that framed the road entrance, and those branches were at approximately 9 feet from the ground. I had measured that tree for other reasons, years earlier. I knew the number. What I was looking at was not a bear. It was not a man. It was standing upright with a patience that I associate in my memory, not with alarm or aggression, but with something more considered than either. It stood the way you stand when you have brought someone home, and you are waiting to be sure they have arrived before you leave. Maren walked the length of that root road, 400 meters, in the early morning light, and the shape at the tree line did not move while she walked it. Bud did not bark. Bud sat down. I have thought about that for 43 years. The fact that my dog, a working healer with no patience for the unfamiliar, sat down in the presence of what was standing at the end of my property, and I do not have a full accounting for it. The best I can offer is that the dog understood something I did not, which is not a satisfying conclusion for a man of my training, but it is the accurate one. Maren came up the porch steps. She was not crying. She was not shaking. She had leaves in her hair, the small round leaves of something in the alder family, and she was carrying, in both arms held against her chest, the way a child carries something she has been given and has decided is hers, a bundle of cedar bark. The interior bark, the soft reddish kind that comes from stripping the cambium layer of a living western red cedar. It had been folded into a rough bundle maybe 18 inches long, and it smelled of resin and fresh wood and the particular coolness of timber country after rain. She had not gathered it herself. The stripping of cedar cambium requires more strength than a 6-year-old has. It had been prepared for her. I picked her up. My legs went out from under me and I sat down on the porch boards with her in my arms, and I held her there for a long time. When I looked up, the tree line was empty. I am not a person who cries easily, and I want to be plain that what happened on that porch was not loud. It was the sound a man makes in the back of his throat when the arithmetic finally comes out right, and he had not believed it was going to. Dottie appeared in the doorway behind me, and she looked at Maren, and she looked at the tree line, and she did not ask me what had been standing there. She did not say anything at all. She took Maren from my arms and carried her inside, and I sat on the porch boards in the wet dawn air, and Bud put his head on my knee. I went out to the route road after an hour when the light was good enough. I brought my hip chain and I walked the 400 meters to the tree line looking at the ground. The mud along the route road held tracks. Maren's tracks were there, small and clear and pointing south toward the house. Beside them, or more accurately, slightly behind and to one side, there was another set of impressions. Bipedal. Deeply pressed at the heel and the ball of the foot in a pattern consistent with deliberate, unhurried walking. The stride length, and I measured it, because I am the kind of man who measures things even when measuring them is going to produce a number he does not have a use for, was approximately 60 inches. 5 feet of stride. I am 5 feet 11 inches tall, with a stride at a walking pace of about 34 inches. I measured my own stride against those impressions 3 times before I wrote the number in my field book. I want to tell you about the 3 explanations I tried, because they matter to the credibility of what I am telling you. The first explanation I reached for was another person, a man of unusual size. This is the explanation a man of my training and disposition is supposed to reach for, and I reached for it thoroughly. A large man could produce a stride of that length at an extended pace. There were problems with this. The depth of the impression in soft mud was inconsistent with human foot weight at any size I could reasonably attribute to a single person, and the foot itself, the shape of the depression, was broader at the ball than anything I have seen produced by human anatomy before or since. I have cruised timber alongside big men. I know what their tracks look like in soft ground. These were not those. The second explanation was a bear, specifically a large black bear walking upright for a portion of the route. Black bears do occasionally walk bipedally for short distances. The problems: 400 meters is not a short distance for a black bear to sustain upright locomotion. The stride pattern showed no transition to quadrupedal movement at any point across the full length of the road. And a 6-year-old child who had spent 36 hours in the company of a walking bear in a rainy drainage would have shown evidence of that experience in ways that Maren did not. The third explanation I considered for some weeks afterward was that I had misread the tracks in the low light and the emotional condition I was in, that grief and relief had worked together to produce impressions that were not what I catalogued them as. This is the explanation that was hardest to dismiss, because I am honest about the fact that a man who has not slept in 30 hours is not at the peak of his observational accuracy. The problem with this explanation is the cedar bug. The bundle Maren carried was real. I handled it. Dottie handled it. A 6-year-old child did not strip and fold 18 inches of cedar cambium for herself in the Skeena timber over 36 hours. Something made that for her, and the making of it implies intention, and intention is the thing I cannot explain away. I did not report what I found on the route road to Les Arcans. I told Lay that Maren had found her way back on her own, that children sometimes do. He accepted that with the relief of a man who had lost too much sleep to interrogate a good outcome. The file closed on July 16th, 1981, with the notation that the subject had returned unassisted. Condition good. I have the copy of that notation in my files because I requested it at the time, for reasons I'm not entirely certain of now. I think I wanted the evidence that the official version existed and was separate from the true one. Maren was checked at the Terrace hospital that afternoon. The physician, a doctor. Peterson, who has long since retired, and I mean no criticism of him, noted mild dehydration, a few superficial abrasions on her shins that were consistent with brush contact, and no other findings. He asked her where she had been, and she said she had been in the trees with her friend. He wrote friend with a question mark in the margin of his notes, as I know from the copy Dottie managed to obtain years later. Nobody asked a follow-up question. Children say things. Maren never offered more than that. Not to me, not to Dottie. Over the years as she grew, we watched for signs that she carried something difficult from those 36 hours. And we did not find them. She was not a fearful child. She was not afraid of the timber. She grew into a woman with a particular quality of stillness about her. A capacity for patience in difficult conditions that I have sometimes thought about in relation to those 36 hours, and have never said so to her. She lives in Prince George now. She is 48 years old. She does not know what I am telling you. I have thought about telling her for 43 years. I have come to the edge of it a dozen times. The reason I have not is complicated and has to do with Dottie's way of holding the truth of it, which was particular and careful and worth respecting. Dottie put the cedar bark in a tin. It was a shortbread tin that had belonged to her mother, blue and white with a dented lid, and she wrapped the bark in a piece of flannel and placed it in that tin and put it on the top shelf of the closet in our bedroom, above where the extra blankets were stored. She never spoke of it in any direct way. I knew it was there, and she knew I knew it was there, and neither of us spoke about it. And in that way the tin became a kind of agreement between us about what was real and what we were willing to say. For 38 years, through 3 houses because we moved twice in that time, through Maren growing up and going to university and finding her life, through all of it, Dottie moved that tin. It went on the top shelf of every closet in every house we lived in. When Dottie died in March of 2019, I found the tin where it had always been. The bark was still in it. It had dried over the decades into something lighter and more fragile than it had been, the oils mostly gone, but it still carried the faint, resinous smell of cedar. And when I held it, I thought about a 6-year-old standing in the grey dawn with her arms wrapped around it, like it was the most natural gift in the world. Dottie had never asked me what I saw at the Treeline that morning. I have been thinking about why for a long time. My best conclusion, and I want to be clear that I am offering this as inference, is that she already knew the shape of the answer, and had decided that asking the question would require her to do something with the answer, and she preferred to carry the truth in the tin and not say the words. That was her right. She was a woman of uncommon precision, and I trusted her judgment on it. In the 5 years since she died, I have thought about what to do with what I know, and I have arrived at this. I'm 73 years old, and my knees are going, and I have a history of the kind of heart business that makes a man's doctor speak to him in a particular tone. And I have decided that the right thing to do is to say it plainly to whoever is willing to listen, because taking it to the ground with me is not something I am willing to do. I thought, when I first decided to tell it, that I would tell Maren, that she had a right to know what walked her home. I am still thinking about that. What I understand when I sit with it quietly is that Maren has lived 48 years as a person who spent 36 hours in the Skeena timber at 6 years old and came out of it whole, and she has built a life on that wholeness, and I am not certain that handing her the specifics of what was with her would add to that wholeness or detract from it. I am leaving that decision open. I'm telling you first, and I'm trusting you to hold it, because a truth this long in the carrying needs somewhere to go before it can be taken anywhere else. I want to say something about the nature of what I saw because I have had long enough to think about it, and because I do not want to overdress it. I do not know what it was. I am stating that clearly because I believe in stating the limits of my knowledge. What I observed was large, bipedal, apparently in control of its own movement and direction, present over a sustained period in terrain I know well, and it delivered a 6-year-old child to within porch distance of her home, in conditions that should have made finding that home difficult for anything unfamiliar with the drainage. It left the child unharmed and provided for her in a material way the cedar bark that I cannot attribute to accident or misidentification. Whether it knew what it was doing in the way a person knows what they are doing, I cannot say. Whether it made a choice in any sense that a man of my training should apply that word, I cannot say with certainty, though I will tell you that the behavioral evidence, the patience at the tree line, the waiting until Maren reached the porch steps, the withdrawal only after she was safe, that evidence points in a direction that I am not going to pretend it does not point in. I will leave the conclusion to you. Bud died in 1991, 10 years after that summer. He was a good dog in every condition I put him in, and I have never had another dog I trusted more completely. I have thought about him often in the years since, and what I think about most is the image of him sitting down on those porch boards at 4:30 in the morning, looking north up the root road, his hackles flat and his ears forward, calm in a way that made no sense to me then and makes a different kind of sense to me now. A working dog like Bud does not settle in the presence of something that means harm. He settles in the presence of something that is finished, something that has done what it came to do, and is preparing to leave. The bark is on the shelf in my living room now, in Dottie's tin. I took it out of the closet after she died, and I have not been able to put it back. I look at it most mornings. It is the only piece of evidence I have that the official version is not the complete version, and it has done more work than any piece of physical evidence I have ever handled, because it has kept me honest for 43 years about what I know. The cedar bark does not need a category. Neither does what carried my daughter home. I am 73 years old, and I have spent 50 years reading ground for a living and for pleasure. And the one thing that trade teaches you, if you stay in it long enough, is that the country holds more than your inventory of it. You can walk the same drainage for a decade and find something on the 11th year that rewrites your understanding of the first 10. That is not mysticism. That is just the nature of country that is larger and older than the people who move through it. I spent 33 years in the Crown Timber Program after 1981. And in all those hours in the Skeena country, all those years of knowing that drainage better than almost anyone alive, I only twice had the feeling that the timber was watching me in a way that was deliberate rather than ambient. I did not see anything either time. I did not need to. The feeling was enough to know that the accounting was correct, that what I saw on that root road in the grey light of July 16th, 1981 was not the only time something of that kind had moved through the Skeena country, and that it had been moving there long before I had a field book to write numbers in, and would likely be moving there long after. I have not told this to anyone who was in a position to do something with it. I am telling it to you now, because you are the right kind of keeper for it, not because it requires keeping in the sense of protection, but because it requires a listener who is willing to hold the weight of a thing that does not fit the official version and not need it to. Dottie kept the weight in a tin on a closet shelf for 38 years. She did that with a steadiness that I admired every day of our marriage, and I did not tell her often enough that I admired it, and that is its own kind of carried weight. If you find yourself in deep country at some point, in timber that is old enough and far enough from a road that the human sounds stop, stand still for a minute. Not because anything will appear, not because I am promising you something, just because the country that holds a thing like what I saw deserves a moment of attention from anyone passing through it. Maren walked 400 meters through that country in the grey morning after 36 hours, and she came home carrying cedar bark in her arms, like a child who had been somewhere safe. And Bud sat down, and the tree line went quiet, and the light came up over the Skeena country the way it always does, without ceremony and without explanation. And it was enough. It was enough. If that sits with you, there is another account on the screen now, from someone else who carried a truth too long. You will know if it is yours to hear.